BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And just a quick reminder, every Monday is Zodiac Mondays. Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything. That's an AMA, so please drop your questions below for things that you would like discussed here on the show. And Friday is an Anything Goes. Any subject is fair game, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, but any subject is welcome. All right, so please share some ideas in the comment section about what you would like to hear about on this channel, and let's get started. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Thursday, and this year, on Thursdays, I've been doing something called the Versus series, where I talk about different criminals in the true crime world and do a compare and contrast in a psychological breakdown way, if you will. But that will have to wait until next week because I've been going down somewhat of a rabbit hole with the Darlie Routier case. I first mentioned her on Tuesday during the True Crime Talk radio segment, and then I responded to your questions and comments for the Wednesday AMA. But there's a reason why I chose to do a final episode on the case of Darlie Routier and the murder of her two sons. But first, I would like to remind you guys that I am also the host of Astro Psych 400, a different program here on YouTube, a different channel really, and Astro Psych 400 is the home of the podcast for sleep. I had several comments over the last 6 months from people who were saying that they use BlackBoxOnlineRadio as a way to fall asleep at night, and I thought, why not create a program specifically designed for that? And there will be a new episode of Astro Psych 400 coming out on over the weekend, and as well as a special bonus episode of Black Box Online Radio. So lots of things going on these channels. I invite you to like and subscribe. And another great way to support the show is to go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel murder mystery inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to have a look at some of the merchandise, and remember, being weird is not a crime. So in addition to watching lots of true crime programs, I'm also a big fan of the show Forensic Files, and yesterday I was running late for work, and I just happened to have the TV on, and an episode of Forensic Files started, and I thought, oh wait, nope, I gotta watch this one. I know I'm gonna be cutting it close, but there was a particular episode that was playing of it was one that I had seen as a kid. I don't know where we were, but it was on some type of family vacation, but for some reason, the family was in a motel room watching Forensic Files, and I don't know how I knew this, because it's been about 20 years, but it was right from the beginning. I recognized the episode. It was the story of a girl who had been abducted at a Christmas party, and another guest at the party had driven her body in his car to some unknown location and discarded her remains. She has never been found, but they did find fibers in his car from the girl's outfit, which contained a patented color made by the company JCPenney called Plum Navy 887. And that was, I think, I remembered the episode not only because I was paying a lot of attention, because at that time in life I was truly connected to the true crime world, and the foundations of my connection were starting out, and that, as I said, I watched a lot of Cops and America's Most Wanted growing up, but Forensic Files too, but just the concept of how someone could create a new color, Plum Navy 887, by blending different colors together. And in elementary school, we even read the book The Midnight Fox, which talks about trying to imagine a new color, and it's a pretty hard thing to do. How do you imagine a color that hasn't been created yet? But people can blend things together in certain ways, and they wanted to make a certain unique color for a garment that was sold by JCPenney, so that openly led to Batman's capture. He was convicted on the kidnapping charge, not on murder, because as I said, they never found the girl's remains. But since then, I've been catching the daily episodes of Forensic Files, and I turned on the TV today, and they were talking about the Darlie Routier case, which I have just coincidentally been following on Black Box Online Radio, and once again I was like, I have to see this episode. I know I'm going to be cutting it close. Still made it on time. I always make it on time, try my best to, But I just wanted to catch up on Forensic Files and watch the Darlie Routier episode because, as I said on True Crime Talk Radio, I was first introduced to this story because of the Forensic Files podcast, an episode that I heard back in 2020, but I really wanted to see it with the visuals, and to provide the most basic introduction. Darlie Routier was involved with an incident on June 6 of 1996, and this saw the deaths of her two sons, Damon and Devin. Damon was age 5 and Devin was age 6. She had a third son as well who appeared on HLN for an interview, but he was not murdered in this event, and this occurred in Rowlett, Texas. Darlie Routier was then arrested on June 18th of 1996, and she was sentenced to death on February 4th of 1997 and is still on death row. But in the previous episodes that I've talked about, I watched an episode of Death Row Stories on HLN that heavily promoted the idea that she was innocent of these crimes, that this double homicide occurred in her home, and they explored the possibility of her being innocent. And then there was an episode on ABC, a documentary, if you will, talking about Darlie Routier's case, and it was somewhat balanced. At first it started talking about how Darlie could be guilty, and then it explored how she could be innocent. But because they showed the part about her being innocent last, it's almost as if they were arguing a case in that way. But something that I said yesterday on the AMA on the Wednesday show is that sometimes there are documentaries that just report the facts, and they aren't taking a strong stand either way. Then there are documentaries that are truly trying to convince you of something, and I would put Forensic Files in that category. It is a documentary-style program that it heavily argues in favor of someone's innocence or guilt, and it was quite interesting to see somebody completely trying to persuade you. By somebody, I mean the show. The show is completely trying to persuade you that Darlie Routier was guilty, because though if her story were to be correct, as we said, her two sons were murdered in her home in 1996. Well, that means that it was a home invader in Darlie's recollection, that she was asleep on the couch. This person had come into the home, had attacked the two boys, had gone to the couch, woken her up. She said she felt some pressure in her nether regions, and then Darlie was also found not wearing any panties at the time of by the time the authorities arrived, and she felt this pressure. Then she's awakened, and then the home intruder runs away from her, and then she follows him into the kitchen because there's this intruder in her house. All she can tell is that he is a Caucasian, he's wearing a baseball cap, he's wearing very dark clothing, and she can't make out any discernible features. And then she's running after him, and they get into an altercation, and she is stabbed multiple times with a knife. Her throat is cut, slashed like right across the throat. There's also a wound on her arm, and as well as some others, and then blood is frequently dripped throughout the house. And a sock was found containing the blood of the two boys about 75 yards away from the house in an alley. And on the one hand, ABC News was saying that 75 yards, that's like 3/4 of a football field. But on the Forensic Files show, they just said, well, it's 2 blocks away. So, I mean, that's kind of giving different perspectives on the distance. But did Darlie actually commit the crime? Did she just make up the story about the home invader? Or did she murder her children and then call 911 and put on a show for the authorities, screaming and crying and saying that someone has attacked her and the boys, and that she found the knife, she touched the knife, they're going to be her prints on the knife? As I said, Forensic Files really made an attempt to show the possibility of her being guilty. Point number 1. There were no signs of sexual assault. She said she felt some pressure in her nether regions, and she wasn't wearing panties. They provided the explanation that she most likely removed them herself to give the authorities that type of impression. But because it's Forensic Files, this case zoned in on blood spatter in a way that I have not seen too frequently. Maybe if you've ever watched the show Dexter, he was a blood spatter analyst and expert, and you can hear all types of things in a fictionalized way. It was very nice to hear about how blood spatter can be used in a true crime way. And the one that I keep talking about is she said that she was attacked by a home invader, and then a glass fell on the floor, and that was what awakened her husband, Darren, who was asleep in bed at the time. But the blood was found underneath the glass and not on top. If the glass had been broken and then she had been attacked by the invader, there should have been blood spatter on top of the glass as well. That's the one that I said on both Tuesday and Wednesday. Some additional points that they shared on Forensic Files is the blood spatter formed in almost perfect circles, meaning that someone was standing over a particular space and letting the blood drip. If she had been running through the house and in a confrontation with an attacker, there wouldn't be these perfect circular shapes. Instead, they would be elliptical, or they would be elongated, or there would be a type of tail that would curve down. You can imagine this if you just even were to take a glass of water and start walking and watch how it drips, then it's going to fall in a rushed, hurried, elongated set of drops, and they're going to splash in an elongated way. That made absolute perfect sense to me. But there's also a point in Darlie Routier's kitchen, a place in Darlie Routier's kitchen, rather, where there were blood droplets that were found on top of blood droplets, and they were right by the kitchen sink. And that is when the prosecutors, as well as other forensic scientists, believe that Darlie Routier actually inflicted the injuries to herself, that she slashed her own throat as well as cutting her arm. And that was done over the kitchen sink, and then she walked throughout the house and staged the scene, including smashing the wine glass to leave the broken glass on top of the blood spatter. And on Forensic Files as well, this is like how they get into some really technical stuff. A vacuum was knocked over in the house, and the way that it had blood spatter on it suggested that someone was leaning over it and then placing it down gently, as opposed to knocking it over in a panicked, hurried motion. But the most valuable piece of information that I remembered from the Forensic Files podcast that was reiterated and replayed in the visual show is that Darlie Routier had a knife in her kitchen that had microparticles from fiberglass on it, and the fiberglass came from a screen in her house, and it looked as if somebody had cut the screen to the Routier's window and then entered into the house and then placed the knife back in the holding block. But that would mean that somebody would have had to have gone into the house, cut the screen, and then returned it to the holding block, and then gone out through the window. It seemed very bizarre, and they even brought in a behavioral profiling specialist on Forensic Files who was saying that type of behavior for a home invasion is unheard of, not to mention that there were jewelry and valuables completely in place. So the long story short is she seemed very guilty, and the murder weapon also was a white-handled knife from the block of knives that she had in the kitchen. But what they shared on Forensic Files was that the knife that was used to cut the screen was a different knife. It was actually the bread knife, and that was a detail that I hadn't remembered from listening to it in 2020. And I thought that was a very interesting observation, because, I mean, let's just say if Darlie Routier was guilty, and bear in mind she was convicted for one of the murders. She was sentenced to death, as we said, in 1997. I had the impression that maybe she thought nobody would look at the bread knife because a bread knife isn't viewed as conventionally sharp, or that's not the first knife that people would think of when it would come to a home invasion. Maybe people would overlook that particular detail. But they found the fiberglass particles from the screen on it, and it really seemed like the operation was completely designed from somebody in the house, and there didn't seem to be any connection to her husband, Darren. Everything was staged by her. And another very, very critical piece of evidence they talked about with the blood spatter was that Darlie Routier had blood on the back of her shirt as well as the front, and it's almost as if there was a type of bloody mist of micro droplets that ended up on the back of her clothing, and that was consistent with somebody striking a knife into the body of her child, as horrible and gruesome as that sounds, then pulling it back, and as she would have raised the knife, the micro droplets would have transferred to the back of her shirt. Another case that I've talked about on the channel, actually back in 2018, was the murder of Billy Joe Jenkins from the United Kingdom, and this case also heavily explored the concept of a bloody mist or micro droplets, and that also revealed how if somebody is going to strike someone with a blunt object or a knife, and then they're going to pull that object or knife backward and raise it up over their shoulder and strike them again and again and again, it creates a mass of micro droplets that should be transferred to both the front of the clothing and to the back of the clothing. And Darlie Routier's clothing was consistent with striking or stabbing someone with a knife, raising it up, and as she raised it up, the blood went on to the back of her shirt. So a lot of forensic evidence was heavily indicating that Darlie Routier was guilty of this crime. And there's also been some debate, though, about how an intruder could have committed the crime and Darlie has simply been railroaded or framed, or that the authorities got it wrong, even despite all of the forensic evidence that I have just talked about. And I definitely have to give my personal stance that they make such a stronger case for Darlie being guilty when you listen to the forensics than her being innocent. But there are people out there who still maintain her innocence, saying that the bruising on her arm was consistent with that of an attacker, and if she were to have cut herself, she would have had to have cut herself with her non-dominant hand, which they also believe was in line with Darlie telling the truth. And there's a website called DarlieRoutierFactAndFiction.com that talks about something that I mentioned in the AMA. I believe it was T. Sully who wrote in saying that Darlie did not have any bruises on the night of the 6th. Those did not come until, I believe T. Sully said June 10th, but there's a section here on DarlieRoutierFactAndFiction.com that says, she never complained of any pain in her arm. Darlie had a much smaller bruise on her left arm. Bruises on both arms were the result of blunt trauma on June 6th, even though the coloration was significantly different. Caught in this contradiction, he then admitted that the right arm bruises could have happened on June 8th. So whether it's June 8th or June 10th, that means that those bruises may not have even been authentic. Also on Forensic Files, I thought it was very interesting that they had no mention of any additional fingerprints in the house, as well as no additional footprints. When I was watching Death Row Stories about Darlie Routier on HLN, there was a very just question mark issue that they raise. There is this fingerprint that they need to extract DNA from. It could have come from a home intruder. And when I was watching the ABC program, they said, "Oh, there's this space on the floor that could have come from an intruder. It's a possible footprint." And I don't know if this is just a media circus, so to speak, or this is just somebody fudging the facts, or they're just trying to create some type of sensational counter story and keep people guessing, because I think that the social element in this one is that people just cannot let things go. They just cannot accept the bitter truth. They cannot accept the bitter reality that a 26-year-old mother would murder her children. And on Forensic Files, they did raise the question, why? Why would she do this? And one of the guests who was featured on the panel discussion was a biographer and wrote a book about the case called Flesh and Blood, and it's actually Flesh and Blood by Patricia Springer. And what she said was, there's not a single motive, but it definitely was not money. It definitely wasn't about insurance. Instead, it was about the lifestyle that she wanted. She viewed the children as a hindrance in her life, and she felt that her husband wasn't participating with raising the children. She didn't want to simply be a homemaker and have her life completely tied up to issues in the house, and she thought by removing the children, she would gain access to the lifestyle that she wanted. And at that point, I'm not thinking about O.J. Simpson and all the similarities that we were talking about yesterday. I'm instead thinking about Casey Anthony, and just how that is exactly the same motive that they have put forward in the murder of Kaylee Marie Anthony. So I think that there's a little bit of history repeating itself. And also, I simply do believe that people just cannot truly come to terms with the fact that a mother could murder her children for convenience. But there are evil people in the world. There are all types of nastiness and evil that occur. And that's why we talk about them in the true crime world. And I think it's why you guys are tuning in to episodes like this and why you're listening this far into the episode, because but there was also a comment that came in that I used during the AMA that said, the only way to truly learn about the Darlie Routier case is to look at the trial transcripts and the appeals, because the media is not going to be completely honest. However, I am the first to admit that this is a social commentary channel. It works like I watch a documentary and I talk to you guys about it, or as you see today, an episode of Forensic Files, or listening to podcasts, or maybe reading a book sometimes, or even examining some of the programs in comparison and contrast. Like I've talked about Death Row Stories, ABC News, now Forensic Files, I just also want to share with you some other resources that are about, because there are numerous books that have been put out on this case, and there is Bloodstained Justice and Just After Midnight, the Darlie Routier story. Both of these are by W.G. Davis. Dateline Purgatory by Kathy Cruz. Precious Angels by Barbara Davis. And A Killer in My House by David Kennedy. And Unbelievable, the story of convicted killer Darlie Routier. And Flesh and Blood as well, of course, as I said previously, by Patricia Springer. So I do not think that there is any shortage of interest in this case, and maybe some people get pulled in to the rabbit hole with the Darlie Routier mystery because they just want to think that there is that piece of evidence there that would suggest that there was an intruder. But Rob S. left a comment during the AMA, as well as a very similar statement was uttered on Forensic Files, that if there were this home intruder, a 6-foot-tall man wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap, how on earth was he able to get into a confrontation with Darlie Routier, swinging a knife at her, and he didn't leave any evidence behind? I mean, he didn't cut himself and his blood wasn't found. There aren't an enormous set of footprints going in any particular direction, other than what ABC News seems to offer is fudging the facts. Like, how did this intruder not leave any evidence, yet Darlie's blood is everywhere, her footprints are all over the kitchen? But one point, though, that they do think is that, again, Darlie cut herself by the sink, then she walked throughout the house to let her own blood very slowly drip, and that she set a vacuum down to make it look like there was a struggle, and then she threw the glass on the floor, because if she were barefoot, she would have very painfully cut herself standing on broken glass, and they thought that she didn't want to do that. That's why she threw the glass on the floor at the end, and that's why the blood spatter was underneath all the glass pieces as opposed to also being on top. So I'm going to be very clear. I believe that she is guilty, and when you listen to a program who is making the case that Darlie Routier did indeed murder her children and stage the scene, it sounds way more compelling than the contrary, that there was indeed a home intruder and just there is that piece of evidence that no one seems to be able to find. Most likely the home intruder never existed, but I will listen to what you guys have to say. I'll read your comments. If you have anything that you want to share, you can put your ideas down in the comments section below, and maybe they will be featured in one of the Wednesday episodes, the AMA, the Ask Me Anything. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also go over to Amazon.com, of course. One more time, look at the book Killer on a White Horse by me, Ned DeHaan, the Teespring page. And you can also follow me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. There's also a page for Black Box Online Radio, and of course BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And I will see you over there on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.